What do you think is at the root of limerence, aka romantic obsession, aka love addiction? Ladies and gentlemen, it is not just loneliness or a quirky crush. Therefore, today I'm taking you on a deep dive through the 10 layers beneath the surface down to the dark root of limerence. Let's jump right to the top level. And if you're new here, shortly, my name is Robert and I'm not a healthcare professional myself, but instead I share a client's perspective here on this channel. Let's start with level number 1 of the iceberg, the obsessive crush, which is basically on the surface of limerence, the tip of the iceberg, what you can see, what you can perceive. And it looks and feels like a crush, but it looks and feels definitely like a really unhealthy one. And this is what we are talking about. You recognize the obsessive crush when you see someone in your life, or you do this for yourself, neglecting relationships with your friends or with other family members, or in general, other relationships. And this crush, it doesn't just show up as some butterflies somewhere in your tummy, some nice feelings, pink glasses. No, limerent people experience this intense crush as obsessiveness, obsessive infatuation, where you are the person who experienced that. You can't think about anything else but just about this other person. And when we're talking about limerence, the other person is usually called the so-called limerent object, so the LO in the limerent language. And it feels like you're wearing those pink glasses day on, day off, and you are somehow massively in love with this limerent object. But reality is that you're not actually loving this person. What's really happening here is that you're obsessing about them. But let me tell you another interesting part about this. In many cases, you have never even met, seen, or heard this person, this limerent object. So even someone that you just matched on a dating app, or that you have just seen somewhere in the window when you sit like in a cafe and you see someone walking by, this can already be enough for someone becoming your limerent object. And maybe then you have different stages, you exchange some messages with this person, maybe on a dating app, maybe you call with this person, or maybe you go actually on dates in real life with this person. And those are all different levels where limerence can appear. For some people it appears earlier, for some people it appears later. But I definitely also notice for myself, because when I was 16, I have this story. I remember that I was crazy limerent on a girl that I used to phone with a couple of times. So I don't know, maybe twice a week I was calling with her in the evenings, and the more I talked to her, the more I somehow crazy was craving to hear her voice. So she became a limerent object in this scenario that I never met in my life in the end. But it also became strangely when she also started to tell me stories about her ex-boyfriend and how they had sex and stuff. And the more I was interacting with her on the phone, the more I was becoming limerent towards her. And at some point she was this obsessive person that I just wanted to meet, and I was fantasizing as a 16-year-old boy back then about a bright future with her, how it would feel like if I would finally meet her and kiss her and hug her and those kind of things. And it never happened. It still stayed this fantasy, but it is a really good example of how limerence can show up with someone that I actually never met. And I'm 100% sure that you also know those scenarios if you have ever been limerent. Now let's get a little deeper here. You might think that this obsessive crush is happening because the connection maybe in the dating phase is already so strong or so special, soulmates and these kind of things, right? But the truth is that limerence rarely grows in stable, secure situations. So it doesn't really grow when you have two securely or healthy attached individuals meeting each other and dating and maybe forming a relationship together. No, it grows best in an environment that is characterized by mixed signals and by uncertainty. Therefore, the dating phase, it doesn't even have to be healthy or good. Unavailable or inconsistent partners, they often trigger limerence far more intensely than available or steady ones. And this already obviously points to insecure attachment patterns here, where uncertainty feels so strangely familiar to your nervous system, but we'll talk about that later. So in these unstable dating phases, you would get often when you text with someone or you meet up, would get those tiny micro doses of attention. And you would get like silence again, distance, and then a random crumb here and there again. And by the way, when someone is behaving like this in a dating phase, usually also that already points to their own insecure attachment style. Because someone who behaves like this, they're obviously not committed or they're dealing with their own relationship anxieties and stuff. But for your obsessive infatuation, for your limerence, this behavior is a godsend. And it's because this unpredictability, it activates the brain's reward system, which is the very same mechanism behind, for example, gambling and addictions. So the real fuel here for this system to be highly activated is definitely a mix of uncertainty with an intense feeling of hope. Those two are highly relevant drivers for limerence. Those fuel the fantasy that maybe this could be something real that you're experiencing with a person, even though there is nothing clear about the whole situation still. But I want to go a little deeper now and have a second view on the mechanisms of addiction in the context of limerence here, because it's quite interesting and very eye-opening. So let's talk about dopamine addiction and also OCD for a bit. If you deeply long for attention since your childhood, then every tiny message, every emoji, every little sign of interest from this person's limerent object hits your dopamine system like a reward. And this is why addiction is a highly relevant term in the context of limerence here. And the neuroscience around love addiction also shows that early romantic obsession activates the same reward circuits as other addictive behaviors. For example, studies here cited in the Gray Matter journal, they explain that the brain regions that are activated in love addiction are also the same ones as activated in gambling addiction. We can read that here. Extensive research suggests romantic love engages neural systems associated with motivation and reward acquisition. With consideration to overlapping activation in the brain's reward circuitry, researchers have drawn parallels between love-related phenomena and neural activities in processes associated with addiction. Also, to include that into the full picture here, OCD, so obsessive compulsion disorder-like tendencies, enter the picture too. Obsessive checking, replaying conversations, and analyzing tiny details, also craving confirmation. Those are definitely things that are increased when OCD tendencies are present. What happens then is that your mind loops, not because you want to, but because the dopamine cycle trains you to keep coming back for the next hit. And at this point, it's definitely not love, what we're experiencing here. It's a compulsive loop that your brain keeps reinforcing. And once your brain is locked into that addictive loop, something deeper wakes up. So let's get to level 4. Your lifelong emotional hunger. On this level of the iceberg, limerence stops being about the other person entirely and starts revealing something about you. Limerence takes root in emotional needs that haven't been met for your whole life. So let's have a look at the basic needs of a human real quick. When we, for example, have a look at the pyramid here, so the pyramid we all know, right? The Maslow's 5 levels of the human needs. We find needs that are also activated during limerence. For example, on stage 3, love and belonging, intimacy, sense of connection. When we have those needs never been fulfilled, abandoned during a lifespan, then it just makes sense that those at some point come up and you need to overcompensate them. And I call this concept the missing puzzle piece that now comes into play. You feel like this person completes something within you that has always felt unfinished. And in the context of limerence, the missing puzzle piece might be something that is giving you attention, validation, obviously a projection onto this limerent object, but it's definitely fulfilling those deep longings within you, the emptiness, the longing for intimacy, for connection, for relationship, for closeness. And this is basically the missing puzzle piece here that we are not finding, or we're trying to find on the outside, and what we are not finding currently on the inside. But obviously, healing doesn't work like this. It doesn't work that we look for someone who would give us that missing puzzle piece that we have never achieved. But if you grow up without consistent love, without the attention, without emotional attunement, then exactly this emptiness, this hole within you, it doesn't disappear. It turns into what I describe as longing. So connection that you want, it becomes something that you don't just need, but it becomes something that you obsessively crave. Loneliness becomes something that you obviously fear suddenly. And together, connection that have never been fulfilled and loneliness that you fear, they create an emotional void that feels unbearable. And this is what you might feel during a limerent phase. So the limerent object feels like the perfect solution here for the central nervous system. It is someone who can finally, potentially fill this gap, give you this peace, soothe the ache, and finally make you feel whole. But here comes the truth. You probably notice they're not actually filling this gap. They're just activating the old wound underneath it. Now, when your unmet emotional needs get activated, your mind tries to protect you, not by connecting with the real person, but by creating a fantasy version that feels safer than reality. And this is why, and we now talk about layer 5 here, this is why so many people call limerence as well a form of maladaptive daydreaming. And what you're doing here is you're building a fantasy of the other person and not a real connection with who they actually are. And this is where it becomes a bit funny with this emoji comparison that I just built. So what I want to demonstrate is, on the left side, this is how you idolize the other person in your mind during a limerent phase, right? Maybe you feel totally attracted to them, and this is just you, by the way. Maybe you wish and fantasize about marrying them one day, or you fantasize about kissing them, getting children together with them, building a family. Maybe you see them as a successful doctor and you look up to them because they have such a high status and they are just number one in your life. And they smell really good, and overall you're just totally drawn to them and you see them on that pedestal. But, and that's the right side of things here, the reality when you would just remove those pink glasses that you're actually wearing when you see that other person up there on this pedestal, what you see in reality, or would see, because you don't want to see that, is that the other person maybe isn't even interested in marrying you. Maybe they are also not in love with you and not even attracted to you because you maybe just texted with them 3 days. And maybe they don't like to kiss, maybe they prefer cuddling, and they also don't want children at all in their lives. And maybe they're not a doctor, but more a rocker. And maybe you are not number 1 on their list, you're just number 3, 4, or 5 of some people they just matched on a dating app. So it is a very different reality that is behind those pink glasses, but you don't see this reality because you are in the limerent phase and totally fantasize. And this comparison accurately demonstrates the fantasy version of that person that you might have in your mind versus reality. But you don't want to see reality, and even if you could, you wouldn't date this person anymore. That's the ironic part about this. So this fantasy, it can also become a form of self-soothing. And this tries to answer the question why we actually have this fantasy. So a self-soothing fantasy is a place that your mind escapes to whenever you feel lonely or anxious or overwhelmed or you're triggered somehow. And there are signs that you are using the limerent object to self-regulate. For example, you fear that the limerent object is nothing like the person you have imagined. And this is what I just described before in the comparison. Reality is so different from what you're fantasizing about. You might also feel anxious when they're out of reach, not because of who they are, but because the fantasy slips out of your control. Or you might even prefer spending time thinking about them rather than actually meeting them because the fantasy feels perfect while real people are unpredictable. I also described self-soothing through limerent fantasies in this video up here, link that in the description below as well. And by the way, if you want to learn to self-regulate better using alternative methods like re-regulation skills, I've prepared all the re-regulation methods from years of therapy in our free workbook re-regulation resources, and you can just download it for free here on our website understandable.net/book. There we have tons of skills, resources, and everything practical, guiding exercises, journaling exercises that I gathered from my especially second therapy, which was a norm-based therapy, so a physical therapy, somatic therapy approach. I also put the full workbook in our premium area. Just go to understandable.net and you can become a member here and join our premium courses. Now, at this point, we are definitely allowed to understand that romantic obsession becomes a substitute for real intimacy. And real intimacy, the thing that most people desperately want, that requires something the limerent mind avoids. Showing up vulnerably and raw, at the same time allowing the other person to see your most unprotected self while doing the same thing with them. Exactly the opposite of what you would do in a limerent state. Seeing the flaws, the gray tones, and removing the pink rainbow glasses here. For now, this was just the first half of the iceberg of limerence. What comes now is something that most people prefer to leave in the shadow. We are talking about deeply rooted fears of rejection and intimacy that are triggered when being limerent. Another interesting truth here is that limerent thrives especially when real intimacy is unavailable or when we don't want to accept the emotional price that true intimacy requires. Because showing up vulnerable can hurt, but it's safe to love someone that you can actually be close to. And this is exactly what creates a dual fear in our minds when we are limerent. We are fearing to lose them, while at the same time we are fearing to actually meeting and getting them. And the explanation for that is, if you're actually obsessing about someone and they reject you, the fantasy collapses and that feels devastating. But if they get too close to you, the fantasy collapses too, because real intimacy means showing up vulnerable, uncertain, and truly seen, which is by a highly chance absolutely not what you're currently fantasizing about. And this contradiction is exactly what fuels the emotional obsession. You're trapped between longing and fear. I've experienced this for myself. Another story time here. A couple years ago, I was texting someone on a dating app, and I liked her photos and info texts very, very, very much. Okay. In fact, I was seeing her as my limerent object in this situation for sure. I was fantasizing about how perfect this woman would be. And then we scheduled a date, and the closer the date came, the more shaky I became. And the exact night before I would see her for the very first time, I was feeling highly panicky, highly triggered, and super overwhelmed. I was anxious. I couldn't sleep for a second. And just hours before the date, she would text me to make sure that she is by no chance at this moment looking for anything serious. She's just looking for friends. This is what she texted me back then. And while today I would see this as a very big dating red flag, it completely crushed my fantasy at this time. It destroyed every sense of hope that I had before. And it also made me extremely clingy and needy, which is another characteristic of limerence for sure. And that was resulting in me writing a super long, awkward text message explaining my whole concept of love and that it's also possible for friends to love each other and maybe a relationship would form afterwards. I don't need to tell you that it completely turned her off and that we have never ever met. Well, this is what limerence is about. And the story demonstrates so well the underlying mechanisms of early attachment wounds being active. Because once fear is activated, your attachment systems come online. And limerence is being pulled to the present and starts becoming a repetition of your past again. And attachment wounds are a huge part of why limerence appears in the first place. Now, it's especially common with, for example, an anxious attachment style where the neediness becomes overwhelming, like, for example, in my example, where I created a super long text message then, and where you feel like you need someone in order to feel whole, and you need this person to regulate yourself. You can't let this go, because if you would let go this fantasy, then you would be dysregulated and feel bad and feel depressed again in a way. By the way, I made a full episode about the anxious attachment style up here. If you want to watch that, link that in the description below as well. So the limerent object activates old attachment patterns, the same wishes and fears and longings that were never fulfilled by your caregivers. And this is why limerence also feels so intense. The longing for closeness, the terror of abandonment, the need for constant reassurance, or on the avoidance side as well, the retreat back into fantasy where everything feels safer and more controlled. Those are the mechanisms that are activated linked to the attachment wounds that we carry. And it's the same emotional search that you have been on your whole life that you're now again looking for in the limerent object. And the missing piece that you have never got in your childhood. And once those attachment wounds get activated, we finally reach the deepest 3 layers of the iceberg. The ones that weren't formed in adulthood or during dating, but in childhood or even through transgenerational trauma. People who grew up with inconsistent affection, with emotional neglect, with chaotic parenting, or a mix of fear and love, they learned something without realizing it. That longing and fear mean connection. And if love in your childhood was unpredictable, was frightening or inconsistent, your nervous system absorbed that as normal. So in your adulthood, you automatically, unconsciously recreate this feeling of chasing love that is never fully available. And this is why limerence so often feels so familiar, why you feel so connected to this person and this feeling. Because limerence in this scenario mirrors the emotional tension that you constantly grew up with. This is where kind of the circle closes again. And this also explains another thing here that I read quite often on YouTube and Reddit. This connection to early childhood also explains why some people experience limerence for celebrities or for TV characters. And I have never had a limerent fantasy with a celebrity, but I definitely understand why so many people experience that. Now, this fantasy of, for example, becoming adopted by a TV celebrity, it becomes a kind of emotional escape for those people. It's this dream of being chosen or being rescued by someone who seems stable, who seems loving or powerful, someone who finally represents the life that you never got from your own parents. And in a way, the limerent object also becomes the symbolic parent you always wished for. The missing puzzle piece again. And you know what's a brutal truth about trauma that is linked to layer number 9 that we're talking about now? When childhood wounds go unhealed, they don't disappear, they sink deeper into your identity. And this leads us into one of the lowest and heaviest layers of the iceberg, which is number 9, low self-worth and shame. Very deep roots of limerence. And down here, promise you that, self-worth is very low. And the lower your self-worth is, the more you look for recognition and confirmation outside of yourself. So with a low self-worth, you start seeking validation from someone who always feels just out of reach because their approval feels like it would finally make you enough. It will fulfill this void that you have within you, finally giving you that peace. And this way, the limerent object becomes the source of everything that you're missing internally. Approval, meaning, emotional worth. This layer of the iceberg is filled with shame, with secrecy, and constant self-criticism. And often people who are having this symptom, they know that their obsession is too much from a logical perspective, but they can't really stop it. Have you ever experienced that? Let me know in the comments. And that shame that only pushes you even deeper into the fantasy, because maybe the other person is seeing that you have this shame and is still accepting you as you are. Usually not gonna happen, but this is what you fantasize about. And beneath the shame, beneath the childhood wounds, beneath this fantasy, we finally reach rock bottom of the iceberg. The deepest root of limerence. At its core, limerence is nothing more but a nervous system survival strategy. Therefore, limerence comes from a nervous system that has been dysregulated by trauma, a system that never learned to feel safe, to feel calm or grounded on its own. And by the way, for the sake of completeness here, highly sensitive and neurodivergent nervous systems are also often more prone to experience intense limerence. And that's simply because they feel things way more deeply and react more strongly to emotional stimuli. But let's recap really quick how the nervous system works using the polyvagal theory. So polyvagal theory tries to explain in simply image here the major states of the central nervous system. So usually we are in the so-called social engagement state, where we are relaxed and calm and present, with no trigger, no trauma present. And then we have activated states. This is where the dysregulation happens. We have the flight state, where you feel anxiety, fear, panic, you want to escape a situation. We have the fight state, where you're ready to fight. Anger, rage, frustration, irritation are present here. Those are the sympathetic states. And then we have the freeze state. And during the freeze state, we have dissociation, we have numbness, but we also have shame and probably also fantasy. So fantasy, when we are limerent, is just another form of dissociation. So we disconnect ourselves from reality and we escape into a potential fantasy scenario that soothes us and calms us down. In a dysregulated state, your body always tries to regulate itself through whatever resources you have learned. So better just download the Re-Regulation Resources workbook. That's definitely more helpful than constantly falling back into limerence. But limerence is definitely a strategy. So creating a fantasy or an obsession through imagined closeness, those imaginations, they help the body-mind system to get back to a calmer state. And then the limerent object becomes an emotional anesthetic, a way to stabilize your nervous system that, for example, feels overwhelmed or safe. And this is exactly why limerence feels so intense, why it feels so addictive and so out of control. Because it's not about the person, not about the limerent object. The bottom line is, limerence is about your nervous system trying to repair an old wound, trying to find a missing puzzle piece on the outside, through chronically regulating using fantasy. And now I'm curious what you think about the 10 roots of limerence. Do you want to add some more here? Then definitely do so in the comments below. Was this video helpful to understand your current limerent state? I'm also curious to read. If you want to support this channel here, definitely go to understandable.net, become a member of our premium courses. Always support the channel also financially here, that I can continue doing this project. Also subscribe, of course, to the YouTube channel, and I'm seeing you in the next video. I wish you a very pleasant, hopefully limerent-free week. See you in the next video.